The alarm tore through my sleep before my eyes even opened. Red light spun across the ceiling of my small quarters aboard the orbital research station Halden Point. I grabbed my jacket and ran, my bare feet slapping against the cold metal floor. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. My name is Daniel Ashford. Back then I was just a communications officer, 26 years old, assigned to a quiet science outpost above the Pacific. We studied atmospheric patterns and tracked old satellites. Nothing about my job prepared me for what came through our sensors that morning. A shape had entered our solar system. Not a comet, not debris, a structure larger than any moon we had ever charted, moving with a precision that no natural object could ever have. I remember Captain Laura Bennett standing at the console, her face lit by the pale glow of the screen. She did not shout. She did not panic. She simply said, "Get command on the line, now." For 6 hours, the thing did not move. It hung in the dark, like a held breath. Every radio station, every emergency channel, every screen on the planet showed the same image, the same silence. Then it spoke. The voice that came through was smooth, layered, almost gentle. It called itself a representative of something named the Creosi Dominion. It said humanity had been observed for generations. It said we had been measured, tested, weighed. It said the results were not good enough. I still remember the exact words, because I played that recording so many times afterward that it became burned into my memory. "You have shown promise, but promise is not obedience. You will submit to guidance, or you will be corrected." Nobody understood what corrected meant, not at first. Governments scrambled. News channels overflowed with theories. Some people thought it was a hoax, a prank by some tech company trying to go viral. Others thought it might be a first step toward friendship, a doorway into the stars. I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to believe that whoever built something so massive, so advanced, must also be wise, must also be kind. I was wrong. 3 days after first contact, a smaller vessel broke away from the massive Creosi structure and entered our atmosphere. It moved low over the ocean, gliding above the waves like a blade sliding across silk. Every camera on Earth turned toward it. Every phone recorded it. People stood on rooftops just to see it pass. Ellen Marsh, one of our sensor techs on Halden Point, was the first to notice something wrong with its trajectory. She turned to me, her voice tight. "Daniel, that thing isn't sightseeing, it's aligning." I did not understand what she meant until the ship stopped directly above a coastal city. I will not use its name here. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would remember the people, not just the place. Millions of people lived in that city, families waking up to make breakfast, children walking to school with backpacks slung over their shoulders, fishermen pulling in early morning catches along the harbor. None of them knew they were being used as a lesson. The ship released something silent, something without a sound of warning. One moment the coastline existed, full of life and morning light. The next moment, a wave of white energy rolled outward from the ship, sweeping across the entire city in seconds. The cameras on the ground went dark one after another, like candles snuffed out by wind. We watched it from orbit. I remember Laura's hand gripping the edge of the console so hard her knuckles turned pale. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. When the light faded, the city was gone. Not destroyed in the way war destroys things, with fire and ruin scattered everywhere. It was erased, smoothed over, turned into something flat and lifeless, like a chalk drawing wiped from a board. The Creosi voice returned moments later, calm as before, as if nothing significant had happened. This was a demonstration. Compliance will prevent further correction. I sat in my chair and stared at the black screen where a living city used to be. My hands were shaking. I thought about my sister, who lived nowhere near that coastline, and I still could not stop imagining her there instead. Every government leader on the planet went silent for hours. Then, one by one, they appeared on screens, faces pale, eyes hollow, urging calm, urging patience, urging citizens to await instructions. It was clear that no nation had any idea how to respond to something so far beyond our understanding. I expected panic. I expected riots, chaos, Maybe even people abandoning their posts and running for shelter that would never be enough. That is not what happened. Instead, something strange settled over the world. It was not fear in the way fear usually looks, loud and messy. It was quiet, focused, almost eerie in how calm people became. Laura noticed it too. She stood beside me at the window, looking down at the blue curve of the planet below. "Have you noticed?" she said slowly. "Nobody is arguing anymore." She was right. The news anchors who used to argue about politics were now speaking in careful, measured tones. The countries who had feuded for decades over borders and trade were suddenly sharing information freely. It was as if some old switch inside humanity had been flipped, and every distraction, every old grudge, had been set aside in an instant. I did not know it then, but I was witnessing the first sign of something ancient waking up in us. Something that had been dormant for a very long time. 3 days after the demonstration, official communication from Earth's governments went out to the Cryossi ship. It was brief. It said only that humanity acknowledged the message and required time to organize a proper response. The Cryossi voice replied with something between amusement and mockery. "Time is meaningless to us. Take what you believe you need." I remember Ellen laughing bitterly at that. "They think we're already broken," she said. "They think this is the end of the conversation." I did not think that. Neither did Laura. There was something in the calmness of world leaders now, something behind their careful words, that hinted at a plan already forming. A week later, I received new orders. Halden Point was to be evacuated of non-essential personnel. I was labeled essential, along with a small group of scientists and engineers. We did not know exactly why, only that new equipment was being delivered to the station under strict secrecy. Crates arrived without labels. Technicians in unfamiliar uniforms moved through the halls without explaining themselves. Laura pulled me aside one evening as we watched a new device being installed near the station's main array. It looked unlike anything I had studied in my training. A lattice of dark metal folded in impossible angles, humming faintly even while powered down. "You know," she said quietly, "I don't think our governments panicked at all after that first strike." "They looked panicked," I said. "They looked human," she replied. "There's a difference." I asked her what she meant, but she only shook her head and told me I would understand soon enough. Meanwhile, the Cryossi ship remained above us, patient, seemingly untroubled by our silence. Their scouts occasionally passed over other regions, scanning, observing, perhaps waiting for the surrender they expected. Every night, I watched the news for any updates, expecting negotiations, expecting more destruction, expecting anything that made sense. Instead, world governments announced only one thing publicly. A temporary global council had been formed to manage communication and coordination during the crisis. No details were given about strategy, no mention of retaliation, no promises of surrender either. People began calling it the Quiet. Historians would later use that same name to describe the 6 months that followed, though at the time none of us knew we were living through the beginning of a turning point that would reshape everything about what it meant to be human. I remember standing on the observation deck one night, staring down at the glowing cities below, thinking about the coastline that no longer existed. I thought about how easily the Cryossi had erased so much life without hesitation, and how strange it was that instead of despair, the mood among people I spoke to had shifted into something colder, something more focused. Ellen joined me at the window, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the far horizon, where the alien ship remained parked like a silent judge overseeing our fate. "They think silence means surrender," she said. "Doesn't it?" I asked. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Not always. Sometimes silence means people are thinking, and when people like us start thinking together instead of arguing, that should probably worry them more than anything we could say." I did not fully understand her words that night. I only knew that something inside humanity had shifted since the demonstration, something quiet, disciplined, and patient. I did not know yet what shape that patience would eventually take, or how far it would go once it was finally unleashed. All I knew was that the stars above us, once filled with mystery and wonder, now felt like a held breath waiting to be released. and somewhere far above the clouds, an alien fleet watched our silence, mistaking it for weakness, never once imagining that the quiet they saw was not surrender. It was preparation. 6 months passed, and the sky above us stayed empty of any new attacks. The Creosi ship remained in high orbit, unmoving, patient, like a predator that believed its prey had already given up. For most of the world, life outside the destroyed coastline tried to continue in a strange, hollow imitation of normal. Shops reopened, schools resumed lessons. People still went to work, still ate dinner with their families, still argued about small things like traffic and weather. But underneath that fragile normal life, something else was happening, something the public never saw. I found out because Laura Bennett trusted me enough to bring me into it. One evening, after my shift ended, she asked me to follow her instead of returning to my quarters. We walked through a section of Halden Point that had been sealed off for weeks, doors marked with warnings that only senior staff were permitted to enter. She placed her palm against a scanner, and the door slid open with a hiss. Inside was a room unlike anything I had seen in my years working at the station. Rows of servers stretched along the walls, blinking with soft green light. Engineers in dark uniforms moved between workstations, speaking in hushed voices. At the center of the room stood a large holographic display, showing a shape I did not recognize, folded in impossible angles, similar to the strange device installed near our main array weeks earlier. "What is this place?" I asked. Laura folded her arms and looked at the display for a long moment before answering. "This is where the real work has been happening since the attack. Not the work the public sees, the work that matters." She explained, carefully and quietly, that the Creosi Dominion had misjudged us in one critical way. They assumed a united world, calm and cooperative, must be a defeated world. In truth, humanity had spent over a century building weapons, defenses, and technologies far beyond what any government had openly admitted, all hidden behind treaties, secrecy, and rivalry between nations. When the crisis came, old walls between countries collapsed almost overnight. Scientists who once refused to share research suddenly poured their combined knowledge into a single unified effort. Military commanders who once distrusted each other now worked side by side, driven by something greater than politics. "We didn't panic after that first strike," Laura said. "We organized. Every country pooled its darkest, most advanced research into one project. Nobody wanted credit. Nobody wanted glory. We only wanted results." I asked her why she was showing me this now, after so many months of silence. "Because you're going to be part of it," she said. "We need reliable communications officers who understand orbital systems, people we trust, people who won't panic when they see what we've built." I stood there absorbing what she had told me, trying to imagine my quiet, careful world colliding with something so massive and secretive. Only weeks earlier, I had been tracking satellite drift patterns and logging minor system errors. Now I was being invited into a project that could change the fate of the entire planet. Over the following weeks, I met people I never expected to encounter in my career. General Marcus Cole, a stern but fair-minded officer who had spent decades studying orbital defense systems long before the Creosi arrived, oversaw much of the technical planning. Julia Ford, a physicist with a sharp, quiet intensity, led a team working on something she called spatial disruption, though she refused to explain the details to anyone without proper clearance. Peter Hale, an engineer known for his work on deep space propulsion, spent almost every waking hour inside the secret lab, rarely sleeping, driven by something between duty and obsession. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand the scope of what humanity had built in secret over generations, hidden beneath layers of treaties, meant to prevent global conflict, but which had, ironically, prepared us for a threat none of us had imagined until now. There were technologies developed from research programs long buried in classified archives, some dating back decades, originally designed for defense against threats we once believed would only ever come from each other. There were experimental energy systems capable of output far greater than anything publicly acknowledged. There were prototypes for weapons designed not to conquer, but to answer overwhelming force with overwhelming force. None of it had ever been used. None of it had ever needed to be used, until now. I remember standing beside Julia Ford one night as she studied readings from the strange device near our main array. She barely looked up when she spoke to me. "You want to know the truth about people?" she asked. I nodded. "We don't unite because we suddenly become better," she said. "We unite because something forces us to see how small our old arguments really were. The Creosi gave us that, whether they meant to or not." I thought about the destroyed coastline, about the calm expressions on world leaders after the demonstration, about the strange peace that had settled over the public even as they mourned an unthinkable loss. "Do you think this will be enough?" I asked her. "Whatever this is we're building." She turned to look at me then, her eyes steady, almost cold with determination. "It has to be. Because if it isn't, there won't be a second chance for anyone." Word within our small circle grew that other secret facilities across the globe had been engaged in similar preparations, coordinating quietly through channels the Creosi never detected. Nations that once refused to share basic weather data were now exchanging military secrets without hesitation. It felt as though the entire species had drawn a single collective breath and decided, without needing to say it aloud, that survival mattered more than pride. One evening, General Cole gathered a small group of us, myself included, into a briefing room deep within the sealed section of Halden Point. He stood before a large screen showing simulations of orbital pathways, weapon trajectories, and something labeled only as Project Threshold. "We've spent the last several months developing something we believe can answer the Creosi on their own level," he said. "Not through numbers, not through brute force alone. Through precision they won't expect from a species they consider primitive." He explained, carefully and without exaggeration, that humanity's scattered defense research, weapons programs, and experimental physics had converged into something capable of striking not just their ships, but their confidence. He did not go into full detail, citing security concerns even among those of us cleared for the project, but the tone in the room told me everything I needed to know. This was not a defensive plan. This was preparation for something far more decisive. Ellen Marsh, who had also been brought into the program by then, leaned toward me during a break in the briefing. "Do you think we're ready for this?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't think we have a choice anymore." She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling, as if she could see straight through the metal and glass to the alien ship still parked silently above us. "They think our silence means surrender," she said. "I keep thinking about that." I remembered Laura saying something similar months earlier. It was becoming clear to me that the Creosi Dominion had built their entire strategy on one fatal assumption, that a species without immediate visible resistance was a species already broken. They had misunderstood us completely. Our silence was not surrender. It was calculation. It was preparation. It was the quiet that comes before something enormous finally moves. As the final weeks of what would later be called the quiet drew to a close, tension inside our secret facility grew thick enough to feel physically present in the air. Technicians worked without rest. Engineers tested weapon systems in simulated environments late into the night. Communication specialists like myself prepared contingency plans for what would happen once contact resumed with the Creosi fleet. I remember the final test before deployment, a demonstration held deep within an isolated desert facility, far from public eyes. Julia Ford's team activated a prototype device capable of folding space around a target, distorting it just enough to render conventional shielding useless. The test target, an old decommissioned satellite platform, disappeared from tracking systems entirely for 11 seconds before reappearing, completely disabled, as though its very structure had briefly ceased to exist within our reality. Nobody in that control room cheered. Nobody celebrated. We only stared at the screen in stunned silence, aware that we had just witnessed something capable of ending lives on a scale we could barely comprehend. General Cole broke the silence eventually, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what we had built. "This isn't a weapon we take pride in," he said. "But it's the weapon we need." I thought about the coastline erased in seconds, about the millions of lives lost in an instant without warning, and I understood, with a chill settling deep into my chest, that we were preparing to answer horror with horror of our own. Laura found me afterward, standing alone near the edge of the testing facility, staring out at the darkening horizon. "Second thoughts?" she asked quietly. "All the time," I admitted. "But every time I think about backing away, I remember that city. I remember how easily they erased it, without hesitation, without warning." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "That's the difference between us and them, Daniel. They act without hesitation because they see us as beneath consideration. We hesitate because we understand exactly what we're about to do." I did not know then how soon we would be forced to prove that understanding. I did not know that within days the Creosi Dominion would grow impatient with our continued silence and send a new fleet, larger and more confident than the first, expecting tribute, expecting surrender, expecting the same fragile species they had witnessed months earlier. They had no idea what waited for them. As I returned to my quarters that night, I looked up at the sky one final time before drifting into uneasy sleep. Somewhere far above, the alien ship remained parked in silent judgment, unaware that the quiet it had mistaken for surrender was, in truth, humanity gathering itself for a response unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The stars above seemed unusually still that night, as if even they sensed that something enormous was about to change forever. The call came at 3 in the morning, and I knew before I even reached the command center that something had changed. Every screen along the corridor glowed with the same alert, a bright red marker moving steadily toward Earth from the edge of our solar system. This was not the same lone ship that had delivered the first demonstration. This was a fleet, dozens of vessels arranged in tight formation, larger and more numerous than anything we had tracked before. General Cole stood at the center of the command room when I arrived, his eyes fixed on the projection hovering above the main table. Julia Ford stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable but focused. Laura Bennett caught my eye across the room and gave a small nod, the kind that told me everything I needed to know. This was it. "They're calling it a collection fleet," Cole said, without looking away from the display. "According to intercepted transmissions, they expect tribute, resources, technology, and what they refer to as compliant representatives." "Compliant representatives," Ellen repeated from her station, her voice flat. "That's a polite way of saying prisoners." Nobody argued with her assessment. The Creosi fleet entered our solar system with the same unhurried confidence as their first ship, moving at a pace that suggested they expected no resistance at all. Their scans, which our systems intercepted and studied for weeks, showed a species utterly certain of humanity's surrender. They had no idea that beneath our silence, an answer had been prepared. I was assigned to a support role aboard one of 3 response vessels, built in secret over the previous months, ships whose existence had never been made public. Ours was simply designated Vessel 3, a name deliberately plain so as not to draw unnecessary attention even among our own personnel. Julia Ford would oversee the weapon systems from a central command deck, while Laura took charge of tactical coordination. I managed communications, relaying signals between our fleet and the ground command centers scattered across the globe. As we approached the edge of Earth's defensive perimeter, I could see the Creosi fleet on our main display, an elegant formation of dark angular ships moving with practiced precision. They broadcast a message as they approached, the same calm, layered voice we had heard months earlier. "Humanity has remained silent long enough. Tribute will now be collected. Resistance is inadvisable." Julia's fingers moved steadily across her console, preparing the systems developed over months of secret labor. I watched numbers shift rapidly across my screen, power levels climbing toward full readiness. "They still think we're the same species that watched a city disappear without a response," Laura said quietly, mostly to herself. "They're about to learn otherwise," Julia replied. Our 3 vessels moved into position, spread wide across a section of orbital space the Creosi fleet would have to pass through to reach any populated region. I felt the weight of the moment settle over me as I watched their formation grow larger on our screens, ship after ship gliding forward with unwavering confidence. The Kriosi transmitted one final message before reaching striking distance. Present your representatives, or correction will follow. Cole's voice came through our internal channel, steady and unwavering. All vessels, hold position, let them come to us. I remember my heart pounding as the distance between our three small ships and their overwhelming fleet closed steadily. Every instinct told me to feel afraid, and in truth, I was. But beneath that fear was something else, a quiet certainty shared by everyone around me, a belief that months of preparation had not been wasted. When the Kriosi fleet crossed into range, Julia activated the system we had tested only once before in a desert far from public eyes. Space around their lead vessels seemed to bend and shimmer, distorting their outlines as though seen through rippling water. Their shields, designed to withstand devastating orbital strikes, meant nothing against a weapon that did not strike their armor at all, but instead folded the very space surrounding them. One by one, their lead ships blinked out of existence for several seconds before reappearing, their systems dark, their movement halted entirely. Confusion rippled visibly through their formation, as ships that had moved with perfect coordination moments earlier now drifted, powerless, adrift in the black expanse of space. Direct hit across 12 vessels, Julia reported, her voice tight but controlled. Their formation is breaking. The Kriosi fleet, accustomed to easy conquest, had never encountered resistance capable of neutralizing their technology so completely. Panic, visible even through the cold distance of space, spread through their remaining ships as they attempted evasive maneuvers, only to find their systems responding sluggishly, some failing entirely. Cole's voice rang out again, calm but firm. Continue the sequence. Do not let them regroup. Julia's team activated a second wave, targeting the remaining ships attempting to retreat toward the outer edge of our system. I watched on my display as our vessels, small compared to the alien fleet, moved with precise coordination, each strike calculated not for excessive destruction, but for absolute certainty. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Part of me expected triumph, a sense of victory long awaited after months of quiet preparation. Instead, what I felt was something heavier, a mixture of relief and unease that settled into my chest and refused to leave. As their fleet became more disabled, ship after ship left drifting and powerless. A new transmission broke through, this time frantic, stripped of its earlier calm confidence. Cease your attack. We surrender remaining forces. Negotiation is possible. Cole exchanged a glance with Laura before responding through the open channel, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the entire command deck. You didn't offer negotiation to the city you erased. You offered destruction and called it a lesson. We're simply teaching the same lesson back. Silence followed on their end, a silence that stretched long enough to make even our own crew shift uncomfortably in their seats. Julia turned to Cole, her expression conflicted. Orders? Cole hesitated only a moment before responding. Disable remaining offensive systems. Leave enough of their fleet operational to carry a message home. The galaxy needs to understand what happened here today. I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread at his decision. Relief that we were not simply erasing every last ship in retaliation, and dread at what message our restraint would still carry to a species who had never expected anything from us at all, except quiet obedience. Over the following hour, our three vessels moved methodically through the remains of the Kriosi fleet, disabling weapon systems and propulsion cores on any ship that still resisted, while leaving enough structural integrity intact for survivors to eventually limp back toward their home territory. It was not mercy in the traditional sense. It was calculated restraint, designed specifically to ensure our message reached beyond this single encounter. Ellen's voice crackled through my headset from the ground command center. Daniel, are you seeing the reaction from other tracked signals in the system? I checked my display and found several smaller unidentified signals near the outer edge of our solar system, previously unnoticed observation drones belonging to species we had never made direct contact with. They had been watching silently from a distance, likely reporting back to their own governments about humanity's supposed weakness. They're leaving, I said, watching the signals retreat rapidly beyond sensor range. Whoever they are, they saw everything. Laura exhaled slowly beside me. Good. Let them carry the story home. As the remaining Creosi ships powered down entirely, drifting silently in the void, Cole gave the order for our vessels to return to Earth's orbit. The battle, if it could even be called that given how quickly it unfolded, was over within a matter of hours. Yet as we made our way back toward Halden Point, none of us felt the celebratory relief I might have expected after such an overwhelming victory. I remember standing at the observation window later that night, staring down at the same blue curve of Earth that had once felt so fragile beneath the weight of an alien ultimatum. Now that same planet had become something else entirely, something capable of answering unimaginable power with precision and restraint that still left an entire fleet humbled and broken. Julia joined me quietly, her reflection faint against the glass. "You did good work today," she said. "Doesn't feel like victory," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "It never does, not really. But it's the difference between surviving and disappearing. Sometimes that's the only choice history leaves you." I thought about the erased coastline again, about the calm voice that had once promised correction, and about the frightened plea for negotiation that had come only after their own strength had been broken. It struck me then how quickly power could shift from arrogance to desperation once true resistance appeared. Word of the encounter spread quickly through classified channels over the following days, though the public remained unaware of the full details for some time. What they did notice, however, was the sudden and unmistakable retreat of the Creosi fleet from our system, an empty sky where an alien threat had loomed for over half a year. For the first time since the original demonstration, humanity dared to hope that survival was possible. Yet even amid that fragile hope, I could not shake the unease that had settled deep inside me during the battle. We had won, decisively and unmistakably, but we had done so by becoming something none of us had ever imagined ourselves capable of being. Laura found me still standing at the window long after Julia had gone to rest. She said nothing at first, simply standing beside me in silence as we both stared out at the stars. "They'll tell others what happened here," she finally said. "Word travels fast among species who fear becoming the next lesson." "Is that what we wanted?" I asked. "To become a lesson?" She turned to look at me, her expression steady, but touched with something like sorrow. "We wanted to survive, Daniel. Sometimes survival looks like something we never wanted to become." I stayed at that window long into the night, watching the stars that had once seemed distant and indifferent now feel closer, watchful, as though the entire galaxy had paused to take notice of what had just happened above our quiet, fragile planet. None of us knew yet just how far the consequences of that single battle would reach, or how the cost of our victory would settle into the hearts of everyone who had taken part in it. The weeks after the battle should have felt like victory. Instead, they felt like standing in the quiet aftermath of a storm, surveying damage that could not be measured in broken buildings or shattered glass. This damage lived somewhere deeper, in the eyes of the people who had made the decisions, in the silence that followed once the adrenaline faded and reality settled in. I noticed it first in Julia Ford. She had always carried herself with sharp focus, a woman driven entirely by precision and results. After the battle, that focus remained, but something behind her eyes had changed. She rarely smiled anymore, and when she did, it never quite reached her expression fully. She spent long hours alone in the lab, running simulations of the battle over and over, as though searching for some detail she might have missed, some alternative outcome that could have avoided the scale of what we had done. I found her there one evening, staring at a frozen image of the Creosi fleet just before the first strike. "You did what needed to be done," I said quietly. She did not look away from the screen. I know that. Knowing it doesn't make it easier to live with. I sat beside her without speaking further, understanding that sometimes presence mattered more than words. General Cole carried his own weight differently. He remained outwardly composed during briefings, precise and commanding as always, but Laura told me privately that he had stopped sleeping through the night, waking often to review reports from the battle, searching for any sign that lives could have been spared, any alternative that might have avoided the full weight of destruction we had unleashed. He gave the order to fight, Laura said one evening as we walked together through the quiet corridors of Halden Point. But giving an order doesn't mean carrying it lightly. I thought about the disabled Creosi ships, drifting silently after the battle, crews trapped inside vessels stripped of power, some of whom likely never made it back to their own territory. We had shown restraint by not destroying them outright, but restraint did not erase the reality of what had already been done to reach that point. Peter Hale, the engineer who had worked tirelessly on propulsion systems for our response vessels, approached me one afternoon with a question that clearly weighed heavily on him. "Do you think they deserved it?" he asked. "The crews on those ships, do you think they deserved everything that happened to them?" I did not have an easy answer. "I think they followed orders, the same way we did," I said finally. "I don't know if that makes what happened to them fair. I just know we didn't have another option once they arrived, expecting surrender." Peter nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. I keep telling myself that. Some nights it even helps. The public, meanwhile, began to piece together fragments of what had happened, despite official secrecy surrounding the full details. Rumors spread quickly once the Creosi fleet failed to return with any further demands. Some believed humanity had negotiated a peaceful resolution. Others speculated we had discovered some hidden ally among the stars, willing to defend us. Very few imagined the truth, that humanity itself had developed the means to answer overwhelming force with something equally overwhelming. Eventually, a carefully worded statement was released to the public, describing a defensive engagement that had successfully repelled the alien threat without disclosing the full scale of destruction inflicted upon the Creosi fleet. Celebrations broke out across cities worldwide, people gathering in the streets, relieved that the shadow hanging over their lives for months had finally lifted. I remember watching those celebrations from the station, a strange hollow feeling settling in my chest as fireworks lit up cities below, their bright colors a stark contrast to the quiet unease still lingering among those of us who understood exactly what had unfolded above them. Ellen Marsh joined me one night at the observation window, watching the same celebrations unfold far below. "They're happy," she said softly. "They should be. They're safe." "Do you feel safe?" I asked her. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I feel like we bought safety with something we can't ever get back. I don't know if that's the same thing." Her words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. We had protected our world, undeniably, decisively. Yet in doing so, we had also revealed a side of ourselves that none of us had ever wanted to acknowledge existed, a capacity for calculated, precise devastation that rivaled the very threat we had fought against. Word eventually reached us, through classified intelligence channels, that other species scattered throughout the region had begun receiving fragmented reports from the surviving Creosi vessels that limped back toward their territory. According to intercepted communications, entire alien governments were reconsidering their assumptions about humanity, some urging extreme caution, others recommending complete avoidance of our solar system altogether. Laura shared this information with a small group of us during a private briefing, her expression carefully neutral as she spoke. "It seems our reputation has already begun to spread," she said. "Species we've never had contact with are already treating us as something to be feared rather than approached." "Is that a victory?" Julia asked quietly from across the room. Laura hesitated before answering. "It's survival. Whether it's victory depends on what we choose to become from here." I thought about that distinction often during the following weeks. Survival and victory, I realized, were not always the same thing. We had survived an existential threat, undeniably. Yet the version of humanity that emerged from that survival felt different from the one that had existed before the Creosi first arrived. We were more united, certainly, but also more guarded, more aware of the darkness we carried within ourselves, capable of being unleashed under sufficiently desperate circumstances. General Cole called a private meeting several weeks after the battle, gathering those of us who had been directly involved in the response. He stood at the head of the room, his expression heavier than I had ever seen it. "I want to be honest with all of you," he began. "What we did was necessary. I still believe that completely. But necessary doesn't mean easy, and it doesn't mean I expect any of you to simply move past what happened without carrying some weight from it." He paused, looking around the room at each of us individually before continuing. "If any of you need support, professional counseling, time away from active duty, anything at all, you will have it without question or judgment. What we did protected billions of lives. It also asks something difficult from each of you personally, and I won't pretend that cost doesn't matter." I appreciated his honesty more than I could properly express at the time. It was easy to imagine military leadership treating such a victory purely as triumph, dismissing the personal toll it carried. Cole's acknowledgement of that toll meant more to those of us present than any official commendation ever could. Julia Ford eventually did step back from active involvement in further defense projects, choosing instead to focus on research designed to prevent future conflicts through diplomatic means rather than weaponry. She told me once, during a quiet conversation shortly before her transfer, that she hoped humanity would never need to use what she had built ever again. "I built something capable of ending lives efficiently," she said. "I don't regret it, because the alternative was worse, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life perfecting that kind of efficiency either." I understood her decision completely. Some of us remained within the defense program, myself included, driven by a quiet determination to ensure humanity never found itself unprepared again. Others, like Julia, chose to redirect their skills toward preventing future conflicts entirely, hoping that the battle we had already fought would remain the only one necessary. As months passed, humanity settled into an uneasy new normal. Trade and diplomatic contact slowly resumed, with a handful of cautious alien species willing to approach us despite the reputation our victory had earned. Others remained distant, avoiding our system entirely, treating Earth as a place best left undisturbed. I often found myself reflecting on Ellen's words from that night at the observation window. We had bought our safety with something difficult to fully reclaim. Yet as I watched Earth continue turning peacefully beneath us, children playing in schoolyards, families gathering for meals, life continuing in all its fragile, ordinary beauty, I began to understand that perhaps this was simply the price required to protect something worth protecting. It did not erase the weight carried by those of us who had made the difficult decisions necessary to secure that peace. It did not undo the lives lost on either side of that brief, devastating conflict. But it did offer a fragile kind of meaning to the sacrifice, a reminder that survival, however costly, remained infinitely preferable to the alternative the Creosi Dominion had originally intended for us. I did not yet know how far our reputation would eventually spread throughout the galaxy, or how completely it would reshape humanity's place among the stars. All I knew, standing at that window months after the battle, watching Earth continue its quiet, resilient existence below, was that we had paid an enormous price for our survival, and that price would remain with us for the rest of our lives. 10 years passed since the battle that changed everything, and I now stood on the bridge of a vessel far larger than anything I could have imagined during my early days as a young communications officer aboard Halden Point. The ship was called the Meridian, humanity's newest flagship, built not from secrecy and fear, but from confidence earned through years of careful, deliberate growth. I had risen through the ranks over that decade, eventually earning a position as senior communications officer aboard this very vessel, tasked with monitoring the quiet border of our solar system, a boundary few outsiders dared to cross anymore. Laura Bennett, now a respected admiral overseeing Earth's expanded defense fleet, often visited the bridge during her inspections, though today she had come simply to observe the routine patrol alongside me. "Anything unusual?" she asked, settling into the seat beside my station. "Same as always," I replied. "Empty space, no hails, no approaching vessels." She nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "That's exactly how we like it." It was true. In the years following our battle against the Creosi fleet, word of what had happened spread far beyond that single encounter. Species who had witnessed the aftermath, either directly or through second-hand accounts, quickly labeled Earth as a place best avoided entirely. Diplomatic channels remained open with a small handful of cautious allies who approached us carefully, respectfully, understanding clearly the price required to threaten our world. Most others simply chose distance instead. Our system had earned a reputation throughout this region of the galaxy as what some translated documents referred to as the Silent World, a place surrounded by an unspoken warning that discouraged even simple exploration. I often thought about how strange that reputation felt, knowing personally the uncertainty and fear that had driven our response all those years ago. To us, our actions had felt like desperate necessity, a fragile hope for survival against overwhelming odds. To the wider galaxy, however, our response had become something closer to legend, a story told among distant species as a warning against underestimating quiet, unassuming worlds. Julia Ford, now leading Earth's diplomatic outreach program, occasionally joined us aboard the Meridian during official visits to distant allied systems. She had spent the past decade working tirelessly to build careful, respectful relationships with species willing to engage peacefully, hoping to ensure that our reputation, however useful for protection, did not permanently isolate us from meaningful connection with the wider galaxy. During one such visit, she shared with me a report detailing recent conversations with a distant allied government, a species who had cautiously approached us several years earlier following extensive internal debate about the risks involved. "They still ask about the battle," she said, "even after everything else we've shared with them since. It's like it's the one story that defines us more than anything else we've accomplished since then." "Does that bother you?" I asked. She considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes. I'd like us to be known for more than just being dangerous when provoked, but I understand why that's the story people remember most clearly." I understood her feelings completely. In the years since the battle, humanity had accomplished remarkable things beyond simple military strength. We had developed advanced medical technologies shared freely with allied species facing widespread illness. We had assisted in disaster relief efforts across distant systems struck by natural catastrophes far beyond their own capability to manage. We had built careful, respectful partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than fear alone. Yet despite these accomplishments, the story that continued to define us most prominently throughout the wider galaxy remained the battle fought a decade earlier, the moment when a supposedly primitive species answered an overwhelming alien fleet with precise, devastating restraint. I often wondered whether that reputation, however useful for our continued safety, represented something worth being proud of, or something that simply reflected the difficult reality of survival in a universe far more dangerous than we had ever imagined before the Cryosi first arrived. General Cole, now retired from active service but still respected deeply throughout Earth's defense community, once shared his own thoughts with me during a quiet visit shortly after his retirement ceremony. "We didn't choose to become the silent world people fear approaching," he said. "We simply chose to survive. Whatever reputation grew from that choice was never something we intended deliberately. It was simply the natural consequence of protecting what mattered most to us." I found comfort in his words, though the underlying unease I had carried since the earliest days following the battle never fully disappeared. We had achieved lasting peace, undeniably. Our world remained safe, protected by a reputation strong enough to discourage even the most ambitious potential aggressors. Yet that peace had been built upon a foundation of overwhelming force rather than mutual understanding, a distinction that continued to weigh on those of us who remembered clearly the personal cost required to achieve it. Standing now on the bridge of the Meridian, watching the quiet emptiness of space stretching endlessly before us, I often reflected on how far humanity had traveled since that terrifying night when an alien voice first promised correction to a species it viewed as insignificant. We had answered that threat decisively, undeniably reshaping our place within the wider galaxy forever. Species who once might have viewed Earth as an easy target for conquest or resource extraction now approached our system with careful caution, respectful distance, or complete avoidance altogether. Ellen Marsh, who had remained a close friend throughout the years since our earliest days together at Halden Point, joined me one quiet evening aboard the observation deck, watching the same endless stars that had once felt so distant and mysterious to both of us. "Do you ever regret what we did?" she asked softly. I considered her question carefully before responding. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that we survived. I think those are two different things." She nodded slowly, her gaze remaining fixed on the distant stars stretching endlessly before us. "I think about that difference often too. I don't think we'll ever fully separate those two feelings completely." We stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the same stars that had once seemed to hold nothing but uncertainty and fear for our fragile, isolated world. I thought back to that very first night, standing terrified beside Laura Bennett as an alien voice promised correction to a species it viewed as beneath consideration. I thought about the city erased in seconds, about the quiet months of desperate preparation that followed, about the battle that ultimately reshaped humanity's place among the stars forever. We had not earned our current peace through friendship, understanding, or gentle diplomacy alone. We had earned it, at least initially, through fear, through a reputation built upon overwhelming, decisive force, delivered without hesitation once genuinely provoked. It remained an uncomfortable truth that many of us who had lived through those events continued struggling to fully reconcile within ourselves. Yet as I stood there aboard the Meridian, watching Earth's careful, respectful diplomatic relationships continue expanding steadily throughout the years since that difficult, defining battle, I began to understand something important about the nature of survival itself. Peace built upon fear alone remained fragile, temporary, incomplete. True lasting peace required more than simple deterrence. It required patience, understanding, and genuine effort toward mutual respect between different species, learning slowly to trust one another, despite vast differences and understandable caution. Humanity had begun that difficult journey years earlier, carefully building relationships based on more than fear alone, even while our reputation as a dangerous, unpredictable species when threatened continued protecting our world from potential aggression. I thought about Julia Ford's tireless diplomatic efforts, about Peter Hale's ongoing work developing technologies designed specifically for peaceful cooperation rather than warfare, about General Cole's quiet wisdom shared freely with those of us still serving in Earth's continued defense. Perhaps, I realized standing there that quiet evening, true victory was not simply the battle we had won a decade earlier, decisive and overwhelming as it had been. Perhaps true victory would only be fully achieved once humanity successfully transformed fear-based distance into genuine, lasting understanding between ourselves and the wider galaxy surrounding us. We had silenced the stars through overwhelming force once, undeniably, permanently altering how distant species perceived our fragile, isolated world. Yet as Earth continued growing steadily stronger, wiser, and more deliberately compassionate throughout the years following that difficult battle, I began to hope, quietly and cautiously, that someday the silence surrounding our world might transform gradually into something built upon genuine respect and mutual trust, rather than fear and distance alone. Until that day arrived, however, our reputation as the silent world remained firmly intact, a quiet, unspoken warning discouraging potential aggressors from ever repeating the same mistake the Creosi Dominion had made all those years earlier, when they mistook careful, patient silence for weakness rather than the calm, deliberate strength it had truly represented all along. Standing there aboard the Meridian, watching the endless stars stretching silently before us, I finally allowed myself a small, cautious sense of pride, not simply in the overwhelming victory we had achieved a decade earlier, but in everything humanity had carefully, deliberately built in the years since, choosing patiently to become something more than simply feared, hoping steadily toward becoming something eventually respected and trusted throughout the wider galaxy surrounding our small, resilient world. The stars remained silent around us, watching carefully, waiting patiently to see exactly what humanity would ultimately choose to become.